When we think of World War I, our minds drift mainly to the trenches of Europe, the infamous Western Front, Europeans fighting through it, and the devastating rot it brought across Europe. Yet beyond these familiar narratives lies largely untold stories. This documentary you're about to watch talks about Africa as a continent pulled into a global conflict, not of its making, where the battlefield is Africa, stretching across its territories, which includes Togoland, Cameroon, Nigeria, Namibia, and Tanzania. It also examines African soldiers who fought in Europe in the First World War, alongside its darker aspects like rapes committed by African soldiers in Europe, rape and arsons committed by the colonialists in Africa, famine, the 1.5 million casualties, and other issues. The First World War started on July 28, 1914, when Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia and the two existing military rivals, the Central Power, who are Germany, Austria-Hungary, and Ottoman, versus the Allied powers Britain, France, and Russia, choosing sides. Since most of these powers control many overseas territories, these territories are going to be involved. The combatants would strike at each other's colonies and find human and material resources needed for prosecution of the war. When Africa was divided among European powers at the Berlin Conference of 1886, there was an agreement between Europeans that in case a conflict arise in Europe, their colonies in Africa would be neutral. Therefore, at the outbreak of the war, none of them had plans to challenge their opponents for control of overseas colonies. There was also a publication by East African Standard that states that they should not fight each other but rather focus on the repression of the indigenous people. Reasons for this agreement include the fact that many of their conquests in Africa was recent and not yet solid, considering some little resistance going on, and the fact that many of their forces had been moved back home when the war started. Alas, it was an agreement to be short-lived. On the 5th of August, 1914, a day after Britain joined the war, they saw the need to have control of the sea, especially with the use of local forces. This is because the Imperial German Navy commerce raiders had been in a trade war, fighting against Allied trades on the sea, blocking supplies which could be used later in the war. This prompted the elimination of German vessels in the sea. To achieve this, the coaling stations where the German ships sourced for coal to power their ships and their wireless communication station in Africa has to be destroyed. These were all at Lüderitz Bay, Windhoek in Namibia, Douala in Cameroon, Dar es Salaam, Tanzania, and German wireless station in Togoland. All of these were German colonies and were going to be the root of a series of war campaigns to be fought on African soil, which is going to involve West, East, and Southern Africa. In West Africa, the campaign to destroy the German wireless station in the Togo was launched by both the French and British colonial forces. Togo was invaded on the 6th of August by French forces from Dahomey to the east, and on 9th of August by British forces from Gold Coast to the west. The battle for Togo went on and ended on the 26th of August, 20 days after it began. The French and British were victorious, and the colony was later shared between both of them. France received most of it, and Britain took the part that became Volta region of Ghana today. The Cameroon campaign began on August 25th, just about the time the Togo campaign ended, and it began with the invasion of Cameroon by British forces from Nigeria, while the French and Belgian forces joined the campaign on another front, outnumbering German Schutztruppen forces 5-1. After a series of attacks and counterattacks, the war spilled into Nigeria in 1915, when Captain von Krailsheim from Garua conducted an offensive into the eastern part of the country. The attack was quickly repelled in a battle known as the Battle of Gurin. The war continued in Cameroon and lasted for 18 months before the Germans and their families escaped to the neutral Spanish colony of Rio Muni in Equatorial Guinea, leaving the British and French in control. The campaign ended in December 1915 in Southwest Africa. By September 1914, British troops tried to invade Namibia from South Africa, but they suffered a serious defeat. Only few survivors returned to South Africa. The war spread into South Africa the following year, when German soldiers invaded part of South Africa in order to prevent another attack on their colony, but the attack was repelled by the South African Union Defense Force. By the end of February, South African Prime Minister Louis Botha had built up an army and ready for second invasion of the German Namibia. They invaded it and gradually captured all of it. By the 9th of July 1915, the remaining Germans surrendered. In East Africa, at the onset of the campaign, the German colonial forces called Schutztruppen were numbered 2,760, which were mostly Africans, while the King's African Rifle were 2,319. This includes Africans from British East Africa, Kenya, Uganda, and Nyasaland. The first strike was on the 5th of August when British troops attacked German outposts near Lake Victoria. The war went on through series of attacks and counterattacks till November. In early November, Indian Expeditionary Force B and C of 8,000 and 4,000 men, respectively, arrived in the east coast of Africa, outnumbering the German forces. Although the Germans became outnumbered 8-1 at Tanga and 4-1 at Longido, the Schutztruppe under Paul von Lettow-Vorbeck defeated the British offensive. In the United Kingdom's official history of the Great War, Charles Hordern recounts the operation as one of the most notable failures in British military history. The victory was a significant achievement for the Germans, as it delayed the British invasion of German East Africa for almost a year and a half. The battle resumed in January 1915 at the Battle of Jassine, where German forces attacked British forces stationed at Jassine, close to Tanga. At the Battle of Mahiwa, October 1917, 3 Nigerian battalion forces joined the British with plans to take on the Germans on one side, while King's African Rifles and South African Regiment attacked from the other side and round up the German Schutztruppe. The Germans as well brought up reinforcements from their colonies and divided themselves against the two British sides. After several days of continuous fighting, the Nigerian battalions were surrounded and suffered heavy casualties. On the other front of the war as well, the British forces withdrew after suffering devastating losses. The battle lasted for 4 days, and the Germans had expended over 850,000 rounds, inflicting around 2,700 casualties on its enemy, while it suffered 519 casualties. Since it is now limited on supplies, it decided to withdraw from its colony and launch an invasion of Portuguese East Africa, where it hoped to regain strength by capturing supplies from the ill-prepared Portuguese army there. The invasion of Portuguese East Africa, which is today known as Mozambique, was swift and successful. They returned after 9 months, sometime in August 1918. On the 13th of November the same year, the Germans took a village in Zambia, and on the following day, the German commander, Lettow-Vorbeck, was handed a telegram which stated that the war had ended in Europe 3 days ago. This puts an end to the East African campaign of the war. The war marked the end of the German colonial empire in Africa, as the German colonies were divided between France, Britain, Belgium, Portugal, and South Africa in the Treaty of Versailles. In terms of casualties, the East Campaign alone saw the death of over 3,000 British soldiers killed in action, 6,000 died of diseases, and 95,000 deaths among Africans who are mostly porters, according to Strachan. In the West Africa Campaign, 927 British casualties, 906 French casualties, and 1,322 casualties from recruited African soldiers. 574 porters out of 20,000 from the colonies were killed or died of disease, and many more permanently wounded. In another record of Pace in 1989, he states that 350,000 lives were lost on both sides. To get the support of Africans, Allied powers posed as crusaders for liberalism and enlightenment. But Africans didn't buy that to some extent because the war made the colonial masters create new laws and policies which had adverse effects on the society. In East Africa, about 1 million people were conscripted to serve as carriers, which caused depopulation and led to famine in 1917 to 1918, which resulted to thousands of more deaths. In the West, British government in Nigeria increased its tax and other fees, which led to the Adabi War in Egba in 1918. About 600 people died, including British agent and a king called Oselem. There was also Chilembwe uprising in Nyasaland, now Malawi, in 1915. As British was galvanizing support of the locals for the war, A Christian leader called Shalembwe campaigned against it, giving his people reasons why they should stay away, which includes the forced labor and racial discrimination they've been subjected to, and the property and human rights they've withheld from the people. This resulted into clashes in January 1915, which led to the death of 40 people, including the Christian leader. In November 1915, a large anti-French uprising broke out among the tribes in the regions of present-day Mali and Burkina Faso. The reasons for the discontent came from the forced military recruitment of soldiers. These regions were subjected to significant recruitment of colonial troops to serve on the front lines of the First World War. The last resistance was suppressed in September 1916. During the suppression of the uprising, over 100 villages were destroyed by French colonial troops. In the German colonies, carriers used by the Germans were rarely paid, and food and cattle were stolen from civilians. A famine eventually broke out due to the continuous food shortage in 1917. This led to another 300,000 civilian deaths in Rwanda, Burundi, and German East Africa. Few Cameroonians were favored by the Germans, including chief of the Bedi people, who moved to Madrid where they lived as visiting nobility on German funds. There was also an internal rebellion among the Cameroonians, where the locals became victims of atrocities such as sexual violence. In one event, numerous killings were committed by German forces, especially in Djibouti, where a white commander reportedly gave the order to kill every native they saw. Close to the end of the war, the Spanish flu reached East and Southern Africa, which resulted in over 500,000 deaths. In conclusion, an estimate of over 1.5 million people died as a direct or indirect result of the war. Because Europeans had to call back their soldiers to Europe at the beginning of the war, they had to rely on colonial soldiers. These includes the West African Frontier Force, WAF, King's Africa Rifle, KAR, Force Publique, FP, Senegalese Tirailleurs, and Schutztruppe. They serve in various theaters of the war in Africa. Meanwhile, the Senegalese Tirailleurs, in a force called the Congolese Volunteer Corps Service, extended beyond Africa. Firstly, it's important to note that talking about Senegalese Tirailleurs, they consist of African soldiers from various French colonies, and they are not limited to people from Senegal alone, although most of them came from Senegal. They had a size of around 200,000 during World War I. Aside of Africa, this Senegalese tirailleur saw action in Europe as well, with around 135,000 of them serving in Europe during the war. They fought with distinction in France during the Battle of Flanders in late 1914, at the Battle of Verdun, in the recapture of Fort de Douaumont in October 1916, during the Battle of Chemin des Dames in April 1917, and at the Battle of Reims in 1918. Losses were particularly heavy in Flanders, with an estimate of 3,200 to 4,800 deaths, and Chemin des Dames 7,000 out of 15,500 who engaged. 7 battalions also saw action in Dardanelles, Turkey, and then Macedonia. There was a practice called hivernage. This practice in the French army is the withdrawing of sub-Saharan African colonial troops, particularly tirailleurs, from colder theaters of the war to overwinter in warmer climates. This started in 1915, and it happens between November and March of each year. During this period, they camp majorly in Fréjus and Courneuve. This is necessary to prevent them from dying of cold-related diseases. However, about 40,000 of them had to share the camp in Courneuve, which was built for 27,000 of them. Therefore, the troops had to endure inadequate shelter, insufficient food, and extreme temperature. Over 1,200 of them died of pneumonia between 1916 to 1917. The site where they were buried is designated as a national necropolis by the French decree of the 23rd of May, 1993. At the end of the war, when the armistice of November 11, 1918 was signed, it was in the agreement that the German territory of Rhineland should be occupied by the victors. This was deemed important in order to give France and Belgium some security against any future German attack, and also to serve as a guarantee for Germany's reparation obligations. Germany and his allies were required to pay 132 billion gold marks. This occupation was overseen by the French, and over 25,000 colonial troops took part in the exercise, which ended in 1930. Although no hard evidence was produced, campaigners claimed that the colonial soldiers, the Senegalese in particular, were responsible for a substantial number of rapes and sexual assaults. Children resulting from these unions were stigmatized as Rhineland bastards under the Nazi regime. The occupation was considered a black plague, and the children as well as their mothers were declared non-German by the writer of the book, The Black Shame, a novel of disgraced Germany. Aside from the Rhinelands, there were other black mixed population between 20,000 to 25,000 who were results of affairs between German officers who served in German colonies in Africa and in the Melanesia, and the women of the colonies they served in. When they lost the colonies, they had to return with some of their families, while some others, their families came looking for them. In 1933, under law for the prevention of hereditarily diseased offspring, a special commission was tasked with preventing procreation and reproduction by Rhineland bastards. Some 800 children of mixed parentage were arrested and sterilized as a result of this. As for the Congolese Volunteer Corps, Pierre Ors, the advisor to the Belgian Minister of the Colonies, Jules Renken, suggested bringing soldiers over from the colony of Congo for deployment. But this idea was dismissed as being bad for the civilization and prestige of the white race in Africa. Reason was that if black people saw the awful conditions in which white people were fighting the war in Europe, they would lose their morals in the Congo colony. But on the 5th of August, 1914, Congolese Volunteers Corps was established by royal decree. They consist of Congo natives who served under Belgium command in Africa and Europe. Besides Africa, the Congolese soldiers fought at every major Belgian battle except for Liège and Halen. Among the Volunteers Corps, there was a Congolese intellectual living in Europe, Paul Panda Farnana by name. After becoming the first Congolese man to receive a higher education diploma in Belgium, he signed up for the Belgian army at the outbreak of the war. Following the end of the war, he set up an association for Congolese war veterans and took an active part in Pan-African activism as a critic of Belgian colonial practices. Most of the Congo veterans who fought in the war settled in the Ixelles district of Brussels, which 40 years later would be rebranded as Matonge in honor of its sizable Congolese population. Some places in Africa served as strategic and military bases for the Allied for the prosecution of the war within and outside Africa. Such bases include Mena Camp in Egypt, near the pyramids where Australian and New Zealand forces camped. In Kenya, there was a British military base which also housed German prisoners of war and some civilians. The Germans had their camps set up at Tabora and Karima. There was also a French camp in Morocco, which is one of the hirvernages for the Senegalese tirailleurs. There were many other camps, but this were the major ones which existed for a long time through the war. These aspects of Africa and the history of World War is often overlooked in historicals, movies, and remembrances. However, in recent years, there has been a growing interest in the recognition of the African contribution to the two world wars. Organizations like the Commonwealth War Graves Commission have worked to preserve war cemeteries and memorials across the continent. Brussels, for the first time, paid tribute to the Congolese soldiers of World War I in 2023. Also, monuments were specifically erected for the African soldiers and carriers who fought and died in the campaigns. To fully appreciate the impact of World War I on Africa, it is essential to explore these monuments. By doing so, we can honor the sacrifices of African soldiers. One of these monuments is the Askari Monument in Tanzania. It was unveiled in 1927 in Dar es Salaam. The monument was erected by the British in honor of the King's African Rifles and the Carrier Corps. Another one in Tanzania is the Dar es Salaam British and Indian Memorial, a memorial in Dar es Salaam War Cemetery that honors some 1,530 British and Indian soldiers who died in the East African campaign of World War I. In Kenya is the Mwashoti Fort Memorial, which is located near the ruins of Mwashoti Fort in Taita Taveta County. The memorial was erected to honor the sacrifices of African soldiers. The fort itself was a strategic location during the conflict, and many soldiers and porters would have passed through, been stationed there, and died there. To mention few, many other memorials, including graves within and outside the continent, exist, and more of them we will discuss in the African history of World War II, because they now also serve as both World War's monuments. Africa's role in World War I is a chapter in history that has long been overlooked. However, the continent's contributions to the war effort were significant, with over 2 million African soldiers and laborers participating in various campaigns. From the battlefields of Africa to the trenches of the Western Front, African soldiers fought bravely, often in harsh conditions and with limited recognition. The war also had a profound impact on the continent, leading to widespread economic disruption, famine, and social change. The experiences of African soldiers during the war helped to shape the continent's anti-colonial movements and demands for independence. Today, as we reflect on the centenary of the Great War, it is essential that we remember and honor the sacrifices and contributions of African soldiers and civilians. By acknowledging this forgotten chapter in history, we can work towards a more inclusive and nuanced understanding of the global impact of World War I.